Hello, this is Matt Buns. Great to be with you for another week. Skill is a really difficult concept to define clearly. The idea of expertise is an appealing topic in numerous domains, but it's often relative. The definition of an expert can range from describing the best long jumper on a junior high track and field team to an Olympic champion in the decathlon. So it's rangy and it's muddy. But how does one go from being that kid that doesn't know how to bait a hook to being a tournament level bass fisherman? Or how do you go from being a cook of hamburgers to a chef who uses fancy sauces? How do you go from not knowing how to apply mascara to becoming a master beautician? It is a challenging task to answer what experts do, how they become experts, what they need to do, what is important to them, and what is not important to them. However, it is helpful to know these points in order to develop expertise. All of us have experienced learning a challenging new movement skill. We all know the frustration of the first clumsy adventures of learning. In the beginning, we struggle just to understand what to do. That's declarative knowledge. And then we eventually refine our movements through practice and feedback, eventually learning how to do it, hopefully with a growing sense of confidence as well. The focus for this week is to examine those commonalities, if any, that exist about how people learn new skills. Are there stages of learning that everyone must pass through? What the evidence demonstrates is that individuals do tend to pass through the same stages of learning, but at different rates. Over the years, a number of different models have been proposed for identifying how people acquire motor skills. And as is often the case, the first model is the most widely accepted today. More on that to come. I won't go into this in great detail, but this is termed the mountain of motor development, and it provides a way of thinking about how motor skills progress from the most basic to the highest levels. Children typically progress through these same stages of change, but again, at different rates. Skills change systematically for children from birth through elementary school. The base of this pyramid, if you can read it, is reflexes and reactions, because those are the earliest movements. Babies have actually been termed reflex machines because most of their early movements are reflexive in nature. The palmar grasp, the sucking reflex, search and retrieval. For example, if you stick your finger out towards a baby's palm, you might notice that they grab your finger. They don't choose to grab your finger. It usually occurs subcortically. Reflexes and reactions are often a reason why some parents place infants into swim programs, because there's something called a swimming reflex. If you hold a baby over water, they will actually move their arms and legs in a fashion that actually models like the American crawl or the front stroke. But it's just a reflex. Installing your infant baby in a swim program is not going to increase the likelihood that they become the next Michael Phelps. And those reflexes will actually go away after some time, usually around 6 months of age. There's a normal time for reflexes to emerge and a normal time for them to go away. For example, when people lose their balance, their arms usually move to catch them before they fall. You can see in the first 2 years of life, they don't disappear, but usually more complex movements often replace them. So back to that startle reflex. When you think about the startle reflex, that's what causes us to open and close our hands when we're startled, and it may cause the dropping of objects. As adults, we're able to override this reflex to avoid dropping a cup of coffee every time that we're scared or startled. If we don't, it may be a sign of a neurological problem. You would expect to see a 2-year-old running with their arms high and extended, almost like a zombie, and their arms straight out, feet shoulder width apart, and a short, flat-footed step. You would not expect to see that same kind of movement in an adolescent or an adult. As they mature, again, the footsteps move towards the midline. Moving up this scale, the next level of the foundation are the rudimentary movements. Those are termed phylogenetic skills, or those movements that are observed in all people in a group. They're often called motor milestones as well, because these movements are really important markers of a child's development. They include things like sitting, standing, walking. And then if you move up a little bit to the top of this pyramid, you have the sport-specific skills. Sport-specific skills are learned and mastered and require a great deal of practice. You may recall from the first week of course, these are called ontogenetic skills. They're learned skills that vary by culture or peer group. Things like incline skating, snowboarding, surfing. They can only be learned, and they can vary by culture or groups or the environment that you're in. The question is, why do these skills change? And there are a number of explanations. Some of the change is caused by growth. For example, as the legs get relatively longer, stride length increases, and that's a pretty big predictor of running speed, at least for children. Similarly, as relative head size increases or decreases, then balance becomes less of a problem. So young children have these really short legs and huge heads, relatively speaking, but as they grow, the legs become relatively longer and the head relatively less of the total body length. That helps with balance. Also, the central nervous system continues to mature and increases the number of synapses and myelination and better integration of information. That allows better motor control with maturation. You might also recall there's a cephalocaudal direction of development. Can you remember what that means, the cephalocaudal direction of development? It means that skilled movement tends to develop from the inside or near the body out towards the limb. You might picture a child drawing with a crayon for the first time. It begins with a very crude grip. The shoulder is doing most of the work. Then eventually, as that child matures, the elbow comes into play, then the wrist, then the fingers, then the fingertips become even more refined around that grip. So one of the reasons that skills change during these early years is that the biological changes work with practice to improve the execution of skills. The importance of practice is one of the most powerful messages that you can ever send to a learner. I've mentioned this before, but kids in particular generally think that they can or cannot do something, and they don't always understand the importance of practice when it comes to improving skills. So if you are working with a wide range of learners or youth, you want to have a developmentally appropriate program. A developmentally appropriate program is designed to recognize these individual differences in the rate of change in the fundamental skills. So they recognize differences, but then they also capitalize on the consistency of the order of these changes. And so you might plan for the average and then accommodate variation by individualizing those groups up or down. And if you're working with kids of a certain age in that 5 to 11 years of age group, studies examining skeletal age consistently show that there can be a 5 to 6 year variation in skeletal maturity among a group of elementary kids. That means that some youngsters are actually like 5-year-old skeletons, and they're trying to compete with others who are as mature as an 11-year-old, or vice versa. So if you have a group of 8-year-olds, for example, some of those 8-year-olds are more like 5-year-olds, and some of them are more like 11-year-olds, creating that 6-year gap, which can present some challenges. So coming back to an earlier question, how do we learn motor skills, and do stages of learning exist? Many models have been proposed to try to describe the acquisition of motor skills. It's not important that you necessarily become masters of all of the models, especially the top three, which would be Fitz-Posner, Bernstein, or Gentile, but it's helpful to examine them to determine which makes the most sense for you so you can select a framework that guides your own professional or personal practice. And like with any theory, it may very well be a combination of any of one of them that works the best for you. So what I'd like to present in probably the most detail would be the Fitz and Posner model presented here. One of the ways that learning motor skills has been described is with these three stages. The first you might call, it's just getting the idea stage. The first stage, the initial stage of learning, is what occurs when there are many mistakes and the errors are large. So that's how I would characterize a stage one learner. Many mistakes and large errors. At this point, the learner is just trying to figure out how to do the task without getting hurt and with as little embarrassment as possible. So your task when working with a stage one learner would be to give hints, to model, and to emphasize the importance of practice. To illustrate this point, you might picture a piano player learning to play the piano for the first time, and they're hitting all of the wrong notes. My mom is a piano teacher, so I grew up hearing all kinds of stage one learners hitting the wrong notes. That's usually how I woke up every Saturday morning. This stage also includes a lot of self-talk. It's also referred to as the cognitive stage. When you think of stage one learner, they're in the cognitive stage because the learners are requiring a considerable amount of mental activity to be able to understand the movement pattern and then appropriately coordinate their limbs. But there's also a lot of self-talk that goes with that cognitive stage. Beginners start to verbalize their movements. It might be a triple jumper that's saying left, left, right, jump to reinforce that movement until the pattern has been learned. Compared to the other learning stages, the largest gains occur during this cognitive stage, stage one, compared to all other stages or any other stage. The reason the largest gains in learning tend to occur in stage one is because they're beginning with very little knowledge and they're making very rapid gains in performance. So the goal here is a lot of practice for these learners. Stage two is often called the associative stage. Performance becomes stable, but there are still errors. In stage two, they tend to be the same mistake over and over again. The learner in stage two can detect their errors, but they don't know how to correct them. In this stage, feedback is essential for you as the instructor. I often consider myself to be in stage two as a golfer. I slice it all the time. The ball goes every which way. In fact, one time I hit a ball off of a building and it did hit a woman that was carrying a baby with her. And this sounds horrible, but luckily it hit the woman in her face and not the baby, just several inches away. Because I sliced the ball so bad, they didn't even see it coming. And I did yell "4," but fortunately everybody was okay. She was just really angry. But so that's why I'm a stage two learner in golf. I understand how to detect that error. I know it's a mistake. I sort of know what I'm doing wrong, but I'm not able to correct it. So I need feedback to improve that type of performance. If I'm ever going to break through what's called the proficiency barrier and take my skills to the next level, I need a movement professional to help me. And that's where you come in as a movement professional. Without your feedback, learning will only improve to a certain point, just like my golf game, no matter how hard I practice. Your learners, no matter how much they practice, will only improve to a certain point without your feedback to take them to the next level. And then finally, stage three has also been called the autonomous stage because the learners are autonomous. Stage 3 learners have a very consistent type of performance with very few errors. They're not in this cognitive stage at the beginning where they're thinking about what they're doing and verbalizing it consistently. Stage 3 learners, autonomous learners, don't have to think about it the way you did when you were learning to drive a stick shift for the first time. The goal is to get everyone to this stage. Of course, progress, not perfection, is the goal. Perfection has been called the enemy of progress in some fields. And again, this is the final stage, which many people may never reach. And if they do reach it, it can take years. So I know that was pretty brief, but knowing what stage of learning the people you're working with are in helps you to develop an optimal strategy for working with them. With physical activity, skill is needed to participate and enjoy in activities. We all tend to enjoy and participate in things that we're skilled at. And we all tend to avoid those things that we're not skilled in. If you're walking by a beach and there's a volleyball game going on and some people ask you to play, if you're skilled at that, you're going to enjoy it and you're most likely to opt in and say yes. If you have had negative experiences with that or have no confidence or no skill in that game, you are not going to participate. So skill helps, but you don't have to be experts. Just a moderate level of skill is all that's required for most activities to enjoy it and have fun and participate. To bring this back to your own interests or profession, I encourage you to pause this video and consider one suggestion of a characteristic from this list that you've noted in a performer that you've worked with. Or within your own activities in your personal life, I encourage you to take a look at each stage and try to describe some characteristics to yourself to note any of those factors that stick out to you. Maybe you've seen some of this in action before. With any of these models of learning, just like within theories, there are some advantages and some disadvantages. Strengths and weaknesses. One obvious issue with this model is that those individuals in the autonomous or expert stage of learning, they might exhibit a considerably wide range of different skill levels. For example, both high school basketball players and NBA players could be in stage 3, that autonomous stage, but are they the same? Probably not. So many models don't take into account the extreme range of performances that can be exhibited by those in the third autonomous stage. And that's okay, because when these models were put together, their interest wasn't in extremely talented individuals. It was more about creating a model for the vast majority of people that were learning jobs, playing sports, or regaining skills that were lost to injury or disease, not necessarily professional athletes per se. And for most of you, that would be probably your line of work as well, where this applies better to the typical, vast majority of people and not these extreme outliers. I'd be remiss not to mention two of the other prominent stages of learning models that have been put forth. The first one that we just went through was Fitz and Posner. A second one is Bernstein's model. And Bernstein proposed a 3-stage model from the notion of the degrees of freedom problem. In the first stage, beginners tend to freeze their limbs, and this is in an effort to simplify the movement. Freezing of the limbs causes movements to appear stiff, rigid, but it reduces the learner's risk for error in the outcome of the performance anyway. Consider, for example, when a young child throws a ball, they often use only their arm. The legs and the trunk aren't used to assist that throw as they are in more advanced throwers. Inexperienced throwers also eliminate the backswing completely. The throw is completed almost exclusively at the elbow, and it often resembles more of a dart throw. As learners progress, they increase the number of degrees of freedom, and that allows their movements to look much more fluid. And it's during that second stage of learning, and according to Bernstein's model, where the learner is releasing those degrees of freedom. When learners have achieved a high level of proficiency, then we can say they've reached stage 3. So it's also a 3-stage model like Fitz and Posner, but this stage 3 is called exploitation of the environment. According to this model, a stage 3 learner, they've released all their degrees of freedom necessary to execute that movement pattern. And then in this model, the main role for a practitioner with a stage 3 learner is to design variable practice sessions that push the performers to continue extending or expanding their capabilities. Also, when working with stage 3 learners, as a practitioner, a major goal is to keep the task interesting and fresh for the performers so that they can continue to stay motivated. So when you think of degrees of freedom in this context, you can think of fluidity. And then the third model, number 2 listed here, is proposed by Gentile, and it's intended to provide instructional strategies to practitioners as well. During the first stage, the same idea that getting the idea stage, where the learner focuses on movement basics. Very similar to Fitz and Posner. Mistakes might be many and large, and they're attempting to perform the skills with as little embarrassment as possible. Then, after the learners have acquired that basic concept of a movement pattern, they progress to a second stage, which is called fixation and diversification. Fixation means consistently reproducing the same movement, and that can be really good for closed skills. And then diversification means they can perform varied skills in unpredictable environments, maybe reacting to a defense before passing a ball. So diversification is effective for open loop skills. Regardless of whether the motor skill in Gentile's model is for open or closed skills, the key is that the learners first attempt to increase the consistency of their movement. And then they usually accomplish this by practicing the tasks in the same and then also different conditions. If it's an open motor skill, the learner will eventually need to learn a number of variations of that movement pattern. Consider basketball shooting, for example. There's more than just set jump shots. There might be a teardrop, a fadeaway, etc. And then after learners have achieved a high level of consistency with fixation, then the same is done with diversification, where the practice sessions should be designed to prepare the learners for very unpredictable environments. If you provide unpredictable environments where they have to adapt in practice, they're more likely to excel in game time, for example, when the same occurs. In a basketball game, you don't always know when you'll have to pass, shoot, or dribble. You don't always know the exact order that skills will be performed. And that's what diversification gets to, performing in an unpredictable environment so that you can do it more quickly when it matters most. So all three of these models, you can use these as a practitioner to think about dimensions to change when you're implementing learning activities. If the practice structure you've scheduled is too easy, they become bored. If it's too difficult, they also lose motivation. So you are looking for that sweet spot where there's about a 50-50 chance of success or failure. That's when motivation peaks. So for beginners, you might focus more on closed skills in a predictable environment. For advanced learners, maybe more open loop skills in an unpredictable environment. Even if you're working with a large group of learners at the same time, or say you have 20 people, you may have 20 learners at 10 or 15 different levels. And so plan for the average, but then accommodate up and down accordingly based on those individual differences. As I mentioned towards the beginning of this video, it is a challenging task to define what it means to be an expert. An expert may range from a junior high conference champion to a gold medal Olympiast. And experts are found in many domains, not just athletes. It's also musicians, dancers, pilots, air traffic control operators, chess masters, surgeons, mechanics, typists, writers, poker players, and others. You might personally know some experts. Think about the experts in your life. What is it, rhetorically speaking, that makes them experts? How did they become an expert? In recent years, there's been an increased interest concerning those relatively few individuals who have reached those extreme limits of learning and performance. If people practice a skill long enough and well enough, they may very well ultimately reach a level of expertise, but expertise does not refer to those three stages of learning addressed earlier. Expertise refers to the far end of that continuum, those extreme high performers, the best of the best in stage three, for example. Because a large commitment of time and energy are required to attain expertise in skills, most experts tend to be professionally involved in the performances of their respective skills. An exact definition of expertise is somewhat difficult to arrive at, and scholars differ on some issues. However, a consensus of scholarly opinion would probably agree with the description offered here by Abernathy and colleagues that motor skill experts, when compared to others in their same domain of skill, are known to A, be faster and more accurate in recognizing patterns, B, have superior knowledge of both factual, declarative, and procedural matters. C, they possess knowledge organized in a deeper, more structured form. D, they have superior knowledge of situational probabilities. E, they're better able to plan their own actions in advance. And not to be outdone yet, F, they tend to be superior in anticipating the actions of an opponent. They also tend to be superior perceivers of essential kinematic information. They also perform in a less effortful, more automatic fashion. They produce movement patterns of greater consistency and adaptability. And then finally, they possess superior self-monitoring skills. So one of the things that sticks out to me from that list is the idea of knowledge. At first sight, the performances of experienced chess grandmasters and professional athletes seem like they have little in common with each other than they're exceptional. Even the brain areas they engage to support their outstanding performances are different, yet there is a reoccurring theme. All experts, without exception, employ their long-term memories to circumvent inherent cognitive and neural limitations. It's this knowledge of experts that enables them to instantly grasp the essence of a seemingly new situation and focus on important aspects of that new environment. It's the memory that guides attention to the right places for experts, and consequently, it biases the perception of experts in some way. It biases them to focus on what's important. In a way, expertise is a highly efficient way of reducing the information overload that the expertise environment can place on the cognitive and the neural system. Experts have a different cognition as well as a different brain from novices. However, it all starts and ends with their memory and its content. Experts' long-term memory stores not only similar combinations of details on one hand, but also ways of dealing with the situations and focusing on the important aspects and ignoring irrelevant ones. Experts, they don't need extraordinary abilities to comprehend the complex situations that they face. It's their knowledge that enables them to look for the light, like the correct light switch, so to speak, in the right place. Some of the prior research to Abernathy's report here involved tennis players in the study of expertise. And Abernathy found that long before the ball contacts the racket, experts can start preparing for their motor sequence as well. So it's not an understatement to say that experts can, in some ways, foresee the future. No matter how good of technique you have on a service return or how quick you are to react, you're most likely going to be in a losing position if you can't reliably predict where the serve is going to land. The same would go with baseball and softball players trying to hit a ball. But experience and practice enable experts to quickly recognize the most important perceptual cues from their environment. A common question that indeed you've read about or seen posted in social media or among your peers or clients is the concept of how long it takes to become an expert. You've probably heard also the terminology involving a 10,000 hour rule, or the idea that it takes 10 years or 10,000 hours to become an expert. I'd like to go into that a little bit and really dissect where that rule came from and the efficacy of that line of thinking. To set the backdrop for this, let's go all the way back to 1993. One of the foremost leaders in expertise research, Anders Ericsson and colleagues, published results from a study of Berlin violin students in 1993. A study of Berlin violin students in 1993. Those findings would go on to become a major part of the scientific literature on expert performers. But it wasn't until 2008, when the publication of Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers book was released, that these results attracted a lot of attention from the outside world, the world outside of the scientific community. Because Gladwell offered a catchy phrase. He called it the 10,000 hour rule. And according to this rule, it takes 10,000 hours of practice to become a master in most fields. And this rule is irresistibly appealing. It's easy to remember, and it satisfies our human desire to discover a simple cause and effect relationship. Just put in 10,000 hours of work or practice at anything, and then you will become a master. Unfortunately, this rule, which is the only thing that many people today know about the effects of practice, it's wrong in several ways. Number one, it's wrong because there's nothing special or magical about 10,000 hours. The number varies from field to field. Number two, the number of 10,000 hours at age 20 for the best violinists was only an average. Half of the violinists in that study had not actually accumulated 10,000 hours of practice at all. Number three, Gladwell didn't distinguish between the deliberate practice and any sort of activity that might be labeled practice. The distinction between deliberate practice aimed at a particular goal and generic practice is crucial because not every type of practice leads to improved ability. And then number four, many people have interpreted this 10,000 hour rule as a promise that almost anyone can become an expert in a given field by putting in 10,000 hours of work. Nothing in Ericsson's original study implied this. Ericsson and his same research team, they went on to conduct additional studies on athletes, artists, and intellectuals. They found the same thing every time. It is an experience that sets the top performers apart, but the amount of deliberate practice that they put in. So although Ericsson would become associated with the Malcolm Gladwell's popularized 10,000 hour rule, the notion that anyone can become an expert at anything by practicing for 10,000 hours, his actual findings represent something quite different. So I'd like to be very clear about this. Expertise is not about a certain number of hours that are practiced. Rather, it's about the type of work that fills those hours. If you've read Gladwell's Outliers, he did get something right, and it's worth repeating because it's crucial. Becoming accomplished in any field in which there's a well-established history of people working to become experts, it requires a tremendous amount of effort, and it's exerted over many years. It may not require exactly 10,000 hours, but it will take a lot. So in any area of human performance, people do have a tremendous capacity to improve their performance as long as they train the right way. Why all this talk about expertise? Expertise is a fascinating topic because, among other reasons, understanding the ways in which experts achieve these incredible feats satisfies our curiosity, but it also helps us better prepare training programs for future experts. And that's a necessity in today's world where almost any position requires extensive specialization and a developed set of skills. Neuroimaging techniques presents a really exciting way to obtain new insight into really complex topics such as expertise. They are not a magic bullet, nor will they suddenly provide all the answers we've been seeking for more than 100 of years, but they do set the framework for the pursuit of expertise and the way that we examine it. If you were to summarize some of the literature on expertise, you would find that the cognitive capacity of experts, just like those of the rest of us, are limited. There are no superpowers and there are no supernatural shortcuts to becoming an expert. But the beauty of expertise lies in the way that experts nevertheless circumvent their limited cognition to pull off their amazing feats. The end product of expertise might look mesmerizingly simple, even effortless, but the process requires a complex interplay between cognitive processes to make it work. That our brain is able to accommodate such complex machinery is a testament to its incredible adaptability. I should note that an expert performance is not a one-off. It's not something that comes and goes. If you were to wake a skilled chess player in the middle of the night and show them a difficult chess puzzle, they would find the solution without much difficulty. Just as if my mom who was a professional organist, would show up to church without knowing what the hymns were, she would find a way to play the hymns without much problem on a moment's notice. Experts see problems with different eyes than novices. Novices tend to lack this knowledge, and consequently they have to rely on rudimentary cognitive strategies. The violin study referenced earlier from 1993 with Erickson and colleagues is illustrated here. World-class violinists and pianists, for example, spent no more time within their chosen instruments than weaker colleagues who also became experts, but failed to achieve the same heights of performance. They did, however, engage to a much greater extent in deliberate practice, as shown here. By the time they were 20 years old, they had logged over 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, clearly more than their less accomplished colleagues who spent around 8,000 hours in practice. The group of musicians who were good enough to become teachers had logged only about half the amount of the elite musicians, which is about 5,000 hours on practice. So it's clear that the amount of deliberate practice differentiates between more and less accomplished groups. A more stringent test would be able to see whether it could predict the performance within highly selected group of experts. That is easier said than done because in most expertise domains, there are no reliable indicators of how good experts are. In those where there are objective or quantifiable measures, such as chess, deliberate practice explains a large part, usually up to about 40% of the variance among experts. And there are similar findings in ice hockey and wrestling as well. So the deliberate practice theory, it's had a huge impact on research on expertise. And as mentioned earlier, it's also found its way into popular media and culture with books from Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, for example. Research investigating the relationship of skill performance between early and later stages of learning typically involves the correlation of some performance measure over time. So to answer that question about the relationship between stages of learning and practice, a correlational analysis is usually conducted. Correlation in this case tells us if the degree of likelihood that an individual will remain in the same relative ranked position as practice progresses. So if the correlation is high, learners stay in the same relative ranked position on performance scores as they progress through the stages of learning. And that makes prediction of relative skill across learning reliable. In other words, those who perform the best initially also perform the best in the middle and later stages of learning, if indeed the correlation is high. If the correlation is low, however, individuals change in their ranked positions as they progress through the stages, and the prediction of later performances or later level is based upon the early performance becomes unreliable. The early performance no longer predicts later performance. And those correlational analyses have been conducted and they yield consistent findings, and they inform really a well-established relationship between skill level and stages of learning. Generally, for most types of skills, the correlation between initial performance and later performance is low. So as one progresses through the stages of learning, the correlation between current performance and later performance, it does gradually increase and become more predictive later on. So in other words, to put it simply, early performance is an unreliable predictor of later performance, at least in initial stages of learning. But as one progresses through the stages of motor skill learning, performance becomes more and more reliable as a predictor of ultimate performance abilities. And it might be a simplistic way of stating the case, but performance in the early stages of learning is not predictive of ultimate levels of learning. Prediction in intermediate stages of learning is somewhat predictive of ultimate skill achievement, and prediction of later stages of learning is highly predictive of ultimate skill achievement. Here's an illustration of the general findings concerning the relationship between early and later performance measures as people progress through the stages of learning a motor skill. In this figure, a common technique of interpreting correlation is used by squaring the correlation coefficient, and that allows you to obtain a percentage. That number indicates the percentage of times a prediction of future performance level based on current level of performance would be accurate. As illustrated here, accuracy of prediction increases in a rather linear fashion, and it progressively improves through the stages of learning. More specifically, the predictive power of observations in the initial phase of learning here is only about 50%, meaning that only half of the time that one attempted to predict later skill learning levels from early observations would the prediction be accurate, and the other half of the time one would be incorrect. But then as learning progresses, say to the middle stages of learning in this figure, accuracy in predicting future performances increases to the 65 to 80% level. And then finally, when you enter the later stages of learning, prediction becomes reliable at 90% or greater. Note that at the tail end of the prediction line, it's curved as it approaches that 100% prediction accuracy level, never reaching that asymptote, that is the high levels of skill. An absolute prediction with 100% accuracy is not possible. There can still be surprises. But a consistent research finding is that an early level of success in a motor skill is not a reliable predictor of one's ultimate potential to learn the skill. prediction becomes more reliable as that individual progresses through the stages of learning. Though even in those middle intermediate stages of learning, the prediction remains somewhat tentative at best. And I think that finding should be of considerable practical importance to you as a movement professional for making responsible assessments of ultimate skill learning. And you can do that based on early observations of novices, or even for that matter, the more experienced learners. Switching gears a little bit, I'd like to discuss some of the approaches that movement scientists have used to disentangle the influence of genetic and environmental factors in the development of motor behavior. As you know, people vary widely in their individual characteristics and their capabilities. It is one of the most obvious facts of human life. Some people are tall and others are short, for instance. Some can sing better than others, or are more artistic, or are better at solving math problems. Some people are faster and others stronger. Some are both. People differ from one another on virtually every identifiable human characteristic and dimension of observed behavior. Sometimes the differences are only slight, sometimes they're extensive. And researchers who study individual differences are typically concerned with two problems. The first is identifying the various abilities that people might possess, and the second is determining the extent to which a person's future performance can be predicted on the basis of his or her abilities. The study of individual differences is grounded in the study of traits. Traits are those genetically inherited factors that underlie our behavior. Traits are stable and enduring. They cannot be changed. Traits make people different, and they predispose them to being relatively better or worse on the entire spectrum of human behaviors. Some traits underlie intellectual capabilities like mathematical reasoning, language, art or artistic expression, musical abilities, creativity, and other traits form the character of our personality, like our interpersonal skills, our self-awareness, motivation, behavioral control, or aggression. Still, other traits underlie our emotions, our feelings, our interests, our curiosity, our ability to have empathy or attachment. And then finally, in a fourth category, some other traits underlie the entire array of skilled human movement behaviors. It's together that these various traits differentiate people from one another, and they're classified as either cognitive, personality, emotional, or physical traits as illustrated here. And this can really be difficult for some people to want to accept, but recognize that everyone possesses the same traits. All traits are shared by all members of a population. So in this case, by humans. Everyone possesses every trait. But you've probably also recognized that some people are better, or we might say have more of some of these traits than others. Some people might be good at math, others, but they might possess poor language skills. Others might be proficient at language but lack musical skills. So another important feature to note is that although everyone is able to improve their performance in each one of these areas, for example, anyone can become better at math or language or playing a musical instrument, they nevertheless have limits in each area. Some people will struggle with mathematical concepts and eventually become competent mathematicians, whereas others will achieve genius status with seemingly little effort. And so we often refer to those people as naturals if they possess a greater amount of a particular trait. Maybe a natural scientist, a natural musician, a natural artist, a natural writer, a natural athlete, and so on. And it's an old idea in philosophy and religion as well that people have different capabilities or talents, and that it's not their differences, but how people use their differences that's important. And that brings us to another important feature of traits. Traits are unipolar. What does that mean? What that means is their value increases only in one direction. Although people differ in the relative strength of their traits, it's also important to note that within an entire population of people, traits exhibit a normal distribution. And you can see that illustrated here. A normal distribution of traits means that most people will tend toward average or normal strength for any given trait. And then progressively fewer people exhibit extremes in either comparative weakness or strength of the traits. So if we represent the percentage of persons possessing any trait graphically, the result is this normal distribution in the form of a bell-shaped curve that you can see here, with most people tending toward a central average value, and fewer people exhibiting extreme scores in either direction. The relative strength of the trait within our population, however, it will increase in one direction. It's unipolar as a function of percentile rank. So as you can see here, the relative strength for any trait, it increases in one direction from weak to strong. Also worth noting that people aren't equally distributed along the continuum from weak to strong. Most people cluster around average, with a number or percentage of people who are relatively weak or strong on a given trait. It tends to decrease progressively as extremes of either weakness or strength are approached. So, for example, most people tend to be average height. We wouldn't expect to see the same numbers either very tall or very short. So you might say, in a sense, through random genetic processes, it's been argued that nature attempts to maintain equality and balance while avoiding extremes within our human population. So the majority of people will be average or relatively close to average for any particular trait. And it's only a smaller percentage of people being relatively strong or weak, and only an exceptional few individuals at the extremes of strong or weak for a specific trait. And so about 70% of people cluster closely around the average or the central value of any strength measurement for a specific trait. It is important to make this distinction between abilities and skills, and you can see some of those distinctions here. Even though performance, proficiency, or skills tend to improve with practice, ability typically remains unchanged because they represent that person's stable, enduring traits. All people have abilities, but again, the strength of the abilities varies among people. And for most activities, a combination of abilities is required for performing most motor tasks. Even with extensive experience, a person lacking the fundamental abilities required for a particular task will never achieve high levels of performance. So a person's abilities really play a role in skill development. The role that ability plays also depends on the task being learned and the importance of the learner's abilities to the performance of the task. So a useful way to illustrate this point might be for you to think about a motor skill that you enjoy, and then the abilities that you have that might be important to the performance of that skill. And so how I talk about abilities and skills with you is different than how I might discuss it with a child or a learner in a practical movement sense, where on one hand, there are some genetic limitations that we'll get to, but on the other hand, that's not really a concern for learners because their responsibility is just to try their best to improve, because everybody is capable of improvement. And indeed, as we'll discuss in a bit, good things do come to those that work hard. Your abilities or your God-given talents, that's outside of your control, but what you can control is how you utilize the gifts that you have been given. Most theorists believe that about 40 to 50 motor abilities underlie all human motor skill behavior, although there is some debate about the exact number, and certainly not all have been identified. There's another theorist, Franklin Henry, and he's probably the most prominent, that's proposed the existence of literally thousands of motor abilities. For several theoretical reasons, a more conservative estimate of 40 to 50 seems more likely that you can accept it and use that information. But of the 40 to 50 abilities that are believed to exist, not all have been identified. And scientists have actually used statistical modeling to try to learn what abilities would be required to produce various basic movement patterns on a wide variety of skills. And the most complete system for identifying and classifying motor abilities was developed in the 1960s, actually by an engineer named Edwin Fleischmann. And subsequently, it's been termed Fleischmann's taxonomy of motor abilities that is partially identified here. And Fleischmann arrived at the identification of 21 separate motor abilities. In this classification system, there's actually two broad categories. What you see pictured here are the perceptual motor abilities, and these are comprised of those abilities for which the central nervous system is the primary determinant of the ability's relative strength. So again, everything here with perceptual motor ability, it comes down to the strength of the central nervous system as determining the effectiveness. The other category refers to the physical proficiency motor abilities. And these depend on, in addition to those neurological factors, underlying physiological factors, things like muscle temperature, mechanical properties of the muscle based on length and origin of insertion locations, even the efficiency of sensory receptors that are associated with the movement, even things like lung volume and the body somatotype, all are thought to impact performance. Another topic worth discussing is the idea of the all-around athlete. Undoubtedly, this is a phrase that people you're working with might throw around, or you might have been tempted to use from time to time. But I think it's important to have an evidence-based dialogue on this topic and how you might address this question if somebody ever asks you, is there an all-around athlete? So how would you answer this question? Does there exist such thing as an all-around athlete? On one level, the answer is obvious. Yes, all-around athletes do exist. These are those individuals that are good at a wide variety of motor skills, and it's apparent to anyone that has spent much time involved in sports. The important question is, why are relatively few individuals good at so many motor skills? And so there are two possibilities in answering this question. Number one is that there's some genetic factor predisposing individuals to be good at all motor skills. And some people are lucky enough to be born possessing it. However, we've seen based on those previous slides and on the extensive correlational research that this does not appear to be the case. The global motor ability, or GMA hypothesis, has not supported it. Another way to answer the question, number two, is it may be that an element of luck is involved. Nature, or the biology of genetics, produces variety, but always trends towards the average. What this means is that biologically determined characteristics like height, intelligence, and motor abilities trend toward the average. Tall parents produce tall children, but on average, their children will be shorter than they are, and they'll regress back towards the average height of the entire population. Likewise, shorter parents are, on average, more likely to have children taller than they are. If nature did not function this way, then given the way in which people select mates, after a few generations, there would probably be only two classes of people: tall, smart, athletic, or short, dull, and clumsy. But we don't have just two classes of people like that. And an important take-home message, I believe, around the idea of the all-around athlete, and well, it involves the concept that we're all more alike than different. Because we're created by God, um, we are created in His image. We're all more alike than different. Um, Even though we're spending some time today discussing some of these individual differences. But another point that you can make with your learners, and I think this impacts your practice, is everyone is good at something. So the truth concerning this observation of the all-around athlete, it's not so simplistic, but people who appear good at everything are really only good at some of the things we're seeing, or the things that they attempt. And the opposite is also true. Nobody is poor at every motor skill. Given the number of motor abilities and all the possible combinations available to support various skills, it's nearly mathematically impossible for any person not to possess the requisite strength of subsets of motor abilities that support highly skilled performance in something. So it's unlikely that there is a person that has no motor skills that allow them to excel at something. So we must look to other factors. Things like poor motivation, lack of encouragement, poor instruction, those types of things can account for some of the reasons that people perform poorly at the motor skills that they do attempt. And this should motivate those responsible for teaching motor skills to encourage every learner until they find enjoyable skills at which they might succeed. So again, it's not as simplistic to say that there are people that are good at everything. They might just appear that way because they're good at the things that they attempt. But nobody is attempting everything. In the 1950s and 1960s, the search was on to see if there existed such a thing as a general motor ability hypothesis. In other words, if you're good at one motor skill, are you good at everything? And so there was an extensive body literature starting in the mid-1900s, and a classic study results are reported here. In this classic study, they actually used Air Force recruits on 6 different balance tests. So 3 were static balance tests and 3 were dynamic balance tests. The assumption was that the same subset of motor abilities would underlie all 3 tests for static balance, and that a closely similar subset of abilities would underlie performance for the dynamic balance tests. The researchers, they expected to discover how similar the 2 groupings of abilities were that were responsible for both static and dynamic balance. Surprisingly, the correlations among the 6 tests were very low, with none of the performance scores you can see here, either the static or dynamic grouping of balance tests being significantly correlated at all. And so the correlations, they varied from minus 0.12 to 0.31, meaning there's really no significant relationship at all. You know, a perfect correlation would be 1.0, and a perfect negative correlation would be negative 1.0. These aren't even close to 1. And on average, the average correlation in this study, and if you were to summarize literally hundreds of similar research studies, the average correlation is about 0.04. And that's what is accepted as the average correlation among motor abilities. In other words, any 2 motor abilities typically have less than a 1% chance of their variance being in common. So another way of saying this is that whatever causes one motor ability to vary or to change, it accounts for less than 1% of the variance or change and another motor ability. And so it's not to establish predictive power, it's just to establish a relationship. And so as a result of this and many similar studies like it, you can kind of quickly disconfirm this general idea of a general motor ability. And in fact, it's very specific. Why do some people perform specific activities better than the other? Take, for example, two people who are both playing table tennis for the first time. Are people born with special talents that make it easier for them to master certain skills and that make mastery more difficult for other skills? Or why does a great sprinter rarely, if ever, become a great distance runner? Is it because of inherent abilities that transfer from similar activity, or is it another reason? I think a lot of it has to do with opportunity, expectations, and encouragement. And these are all factors that you can control with the people that you're working with. Here's a chart I put together that shows some of the gender differences at the world-class world record holder level across the decades for the women's 100 and 400 meter dash and the men's 100 and 400 meter dash. You can take a look at by decade dating back to 1923 what the men and women world records were and then the percent differences between the two. Does anything stick out to you? You can see that both males and females improved over this span of 100 years, or almost 100 years. However, females clearly improved more. Why is that? It probably has something to do with opportunity, expectations, and encouragement being much different today than they were in 1923 for females. Consider the 800-meter run, for example. I know this is the 100 and 400, but the 800-meter run was banned from the Olympics from 1928 to 1964, I believe, for women. Because females, and I kid you not, they were considered too weak and delicate to run such long distances. And in the 1950s, when the 800-meter run was reintroduced for women in Europe, they had ambulances stationed at the finish line with the motors running, ready to carry off the casualties. And so that might be the result of something that was called, the Victorian influence. But in 1963, the women's world marathon record, which was not an Olympic sport for women at the time, it was 3 hours and 37 minutes. And that's a time that's now commonly achieved by females not considered to be elite athletes. Now the world record for the women is closer to like 2 hours, a huge improvement in the percentage. But today compared to 1923, today world-class athletes, they're all motivated, they're well-trained, and they're well-coached. But at this level, males and females still differ by about 10% in performance. And so you could use this to make the case that this is more of a true biological difference. Whereas before puberty, boys and girls are biologically about the same. You should expect no differences before puberty. But this provides some evidence that after puberty, adult males and females might differ by about 10% biologically when it comes to activities that involve certain amounts of strength or speed. There are different scientific explanations for talent, but one of the main versions is that inherited biological factors define the upper limits of your performance. And this is called the theory of biological limits. Emphasis on theory. According to this theory of biological limits, our genes, or more precisely, complex combinations of hundreds of genes, determine whether we could become experts or even world-class performers in our chosen domains. So according to this theory, we would need to practice, and practice a lot to reach these limits. But no amount of practice or any other external factor would help us push beyond our biologically predetermined bounds. Take, for example, height. We know that since the beginning of the last century, the average height of people has steadily increased. People have never been taller at any point in history than they are right now. It's also clear that we've not evolved as a species in such a short time, and that nutrition and healthcare, which have never been better, have a huge impact on growth. Still, even with the best care and food, you are not going to be tall enough for the National Basketball Association if you weren't born with the right combination of genes. Similarly, athletic records are broken all of the time, even those that seem to be set in stone for eternity. Some records, it seems like they could be delusional. For example, it's delusional to think that humans will ever run 100 meters in under 4 seconds, or that they'll be able to jump over 15 meters in the high jump. There have to be some type of limits that are set by a genetic makeup, and it makes sense that these limits might vary from person to person. That is the premise of the theory of biological limits. You're probably wondering, do you buy into this or not? Is it kind of negative or a little bit depressing? But the theory of biological limits, it's hard to prove, and it's also hard to disprove. So specifying the function of a single gene is difficult enough, let alone a cluster of several hundreds or thousands that are probably involved in experts' performance. The limits might be there, but no human is going to start jumping like a kangaroo or running like a cheetah all of a sudden. So the topic, it's extremely popular, but it's also controversial. Even if motor abilities establish a ceiling of performance potential, it's important to note that many other factors influence how closely a person will come to achieving their potential. And those factors are cited right here. And so as we wrap up this video for the week, I would like to just discuss this idea of effort and talent one more time, because it's one of the most enduring of all beliefs about human nature, that natural talent plays a major role in determining ability. There's this belief that some people are born with natural endowments that make it easier for them to become outstanding athletes or musicians or chess players or writers or mathematicians or whatever. And so while they may still need a certain amount of practice to develop their skills, some people are, just based on the way they're born, need far less practice than others who are not as talented, and they can ultimately reach greater heights. But listen clearly, research on expertise, it points to quite a different explanation for why some people ultimately develop greater abilities in an area than others. And it's deliberate practice that plays the primary role. Innate characteristics, they tend to play a much smaller and much different role than people generally assume. So on the concept of genetics, there's no evidence that any genetically determined abilities really play a strong role in deciding who will be among the best. I believe personally this is why it's so difficult to predict who will rise to the top of any given field, especially early on in practice. So if some sort of innate ability were playing a role in deciding who eventually becomes the best in a particular area, it would be much easier to spot those future champions. We could just look at their genes and then know who the champions are going to be. If the best professional football players were the ones who were born with some sort of gift for football, then that gift should certainly be apparent by the time they're in college, at which point they've generally been playing football for half a dozen years or more. But in reality, no one has really ever figured out how to look at college football players and figure out which ones will be the best and which ones will be the duds in the pros. A 2012 study of tennis players actually looked at the success of rankings of junior tennis players. That is, the younger players who are working and competing to become professionals. And they compared the younger player's success with their success after turning pro. What they found was there was no relationship. If differences in innate talent were playing a role in determining the best professional tennis players, you'd think those differences would have been noticeable during their junior tennis years as well, but they were not. And so the bottom line is this, that no one has ever managed to figure out how to identify people with innate talent. No one has ever found a gene variant that predicts superior performance in one area or another. And no one has ever come up with a way to say, test young children and identify which among them will be the best athletes or the best mathematicians or the best doctors or the best musicians. Genetic differences, they might exist, but if they exist, they're most likely to manifest themselves through the practice and the efforts that go into developing a skill. As we come to the end, by now you've realized that there are no shortcuts to expertise, and that no matter how intelligent, quick, or powerful people are, they'll have to put in some time to achieve the outstanding performances that we associate with experts. Fortunately, the human brain is a marvelous piece of neural machinery, and if given enough time and the right kind of practice, it can adapt to the constraints of any type of environment. And that is the good news. Blessings on your week. I'm looking forward to connecting with you again soon.